Hello. Welcome to another video on our channel. Here we translate testimonies from people who have had near-death experiences and other spiritual experiences. Today we are going to learn about the history of Montserrat Valdevez. She says she died and discovered that we live in a big simulation. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Leave a comment with your name and city. Now let's listen to Montserrat's testimony. Hello, my name is Montserrat. I'm a military doctor and have been stationed in El Paso, Texas for a few years. My life has always been dedicated to caring for others, whether in hospitals or in conflict zones. I never imagined that one day I would be here, telling a story that completely changed my perspective on life and death. It all started on an ordinary day at work. El Paso is known for its hot, dry weather, and that day was no different. I was at the military base, seeing patients as usual, when I began to feel unusually tired and persistently nauseous. At first I thought it was just the stress of work or maybe the flu coming on, but something told me it was different. I decided to get a quick exam at the base hospital, more to reassure myself than because I truly believed anything was wrong. That was when I received the news that would change my life. I was pregnant. The surprise was immense. As a doctor, I knew the risks of pregnancy in a military zone, but at the same time, I felt an inexplicable joy. My friend and coworker, Lieutenant Miguel, was the first to know. I clearly remember his wide smile when I told him, followed by an expression of concern. "Montserrat, that's amazing," he said, "but we need to make sure you're okay? The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. I continued working, trying to maintain a normal routine, but my body started to show signs that something wasn't right. That's when I met Dr. Ernesto Delgado, my obstetrician, who diagnosed preeclampsia. The symptoms were clear: high blood pressure, swelling, and urine tests showing alarming levels of protein. At that moment, I realized that my journey would be more challenging than I could have imagined. But I wasn't alone. In addition to Miguel's support, my mission companion, Paloma, became my pillar of strength. She was always there, reminding me to take care of myself and reassuring me that I was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. Little did I know that this strength would be tested to the extreme in the following months, and that an experience that bordered on the unbelievable was about to change everything I knew about life, death, and existence itself. The weeks following the preeclampsia diagnosis were a true test of endurance. Visits to the hospital became more and more frequent, and each examination brought a new concern. I remember looking at the monitors, seeing my blood pressure rising higher and higher, and feeling a mix of fear and determination. Paloma, my faithful companion, was always by my side. She held my hand during exams and constantly reminded me to take deep breaths. "You are strong, Montserrat. You will get through this," she repeated like a mantra, and I clung to those words like they were a lifeline. Dr. Delgado did his best to control my symptoms, but it was an uphill battle. The blood pressure-lowering medications seemed to have little effect, and the swelling in my body increased every day. I could feel my body fighting, trying to protect the little being growing inside me. As the pregnancy progressed, it became increasingly difficult to continue my duties at the base. Miguel and my superiors insisted that I take a leave of absence, but I resisted. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was fear of being alone with my thoughts and worries. When I reached 36 weeks, my body finally showed signs that it couldn't take anymore. I remember that day vividly. I woke up feeling a severe headache and my vision was blurry. Paloma rushed me to the hospital, where Dr. Delgado did a quick assessment and decided it was time to induce labor. The induction process began with the administration of Pitocin and the insertion of a Foley lamp. I was scared, but I tried to stay strong. Miguel and Paloma took turns at my side, offering words of encouragement and holding my hand during contractions. The hours dragged on and the contractions became more and more intense. I could feel my body fighting, resisting the process. The pain was almost unbearable, but I refused to give up. Each contraction was like a giant wave engulfing me, and I struggled to keep my head above water. The next 68 hours were the longest and most intense of my life. I alternated between moments of lucidity and periods of total exhaustion. Doctors and nurses came in and out of the room, adjusting medications and monitoring my vital signs. I could see the concern in their eyes, even as they tried to reassure me. It was during this period that I began to feel that something bigger was happening. It was as if my body was preparing me not just for the birth of my son, but for a much deeper and more transformative journey. The 68 hours of labor induction were just the prelude to the real challenge that was to come. I clearly remember the moment everything changed. I was exhausted. My body ached in a way I had never experienced before, when suddenly I felt a drastic change. My vision became blurred and I began to hear the voices of doctors and nurses as if they were very far away. The monitor next to my bed started making a high-pitched, insistent sound. Even in my semi-conscious state, I knew this wasn't a good sign. Dr. Delgado rushed into the room, his face a mask of concern. "Her blood pressure is critical," I heard him say. "We need to do an emergency C-section now." Everything happened very quickly after that. I was rushed to the operating room, the lights from the hallway blurring above me. Miguel was next to me, holding my hand tightly. "Don't give up, Montserrat. We're with you," he said, his voice shaking slightly. In the operating room, the medical team moved with an urgency I had never seen before, not even during my years as a military doctor. I could feel the weight of the situation, the gravity of the moment. The anesthesia was administered and I felt my body relax, but my mind remained alert. I could hear the sound of surgical instruments, the tense voices of doctors giving instructions. Time seemed to drag by. Finally, I heard my baby cry. It was a faint, distant sound, but the most beautiful I have ever heard in my entire life. For a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief and happiness wash over me. But this happiness was short-lived. Shortly after my son was born, I felt a drastic change in my body. It was as if all my strength was being drained. I heard someone shout, "She's losing too much blood." And then everything started to get dark. I was conscious enough to understand what was happening. My body was going into hypovolemic shock due to the severe hemorrhaging. In a matter of minutes, I lost almost 4 liters of blood. I felt my heart struggling to keep beating, each beat weaker than the last. My breathing became shallow and then stopped. It was at that moment that everything changed. It was at that moment that I left this world and entered a completely different reality. The last things I heard were the frantic voices of the doctors and the sound of the defibrillator being charged. Then, silence. A deep and absolute silence that marked the beginning of the most extraordinary and transformative experience of my life. The moment my heart stopped beating was the beginning of a journey that challenged everything I believed I knew about life and death. Suddenly there was no more pain, no more fear. It was as if I had been freed from all physical limitations. In an instant I found myself enveloped by a deep, pulsing darkness. But it wasn't a frightening or oppressive darkness. On the contrary, it was welcoming and relaxing. It was like I was floating in an infinite ocean of consciousness. In this vast, dark space, I no longer felt like a separate entity. It was as if I had merged with something greater, something I can only describe as Source. I was the darkness, and the darkness was me. There was no distinction between what was me and what was the environment around me. The feeling of unity was overwhelming. For the first time in my life, I truly felt part of something bigger. There were no longer the barriers of the ego, the worries of everyday life, the fears and anxieties that accompany us in earthly life. All of that was gone, replaced by a sense of absolute belonging. All around me, I noticed points of light floating gently. Each point seemed to have its own consciousness, as if they were other souls or forms of energy. There was no verbal communication, but I could feel an exchange of information and emotions happening on a much deeper level than any conversation I had ever had in my life. The emotions that invaded me are difficult to describe in human words. It was a total rapture, a feeling of bliss that was beyond anything I had ever experienced. The peace I felt was absolute, as if all the conflicts and problems of existence had been resolved at once. But most of all, what I felt was love. An unconditional, universal love that seemed to permeate every particle of that space. It was a love that accepted everything, that didn't judge, that simply was. At that moment, I understood that this love was the true essence of the universe. It was in this state of contentment and deep understanding that a revelation hit me. Our entire existence, everything we consider reality, is actually a huge simulation. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes, revealing a truth that had been there all along but that I couldn't see. I realized that the system we live in involves us in layers and layers of lies and illusions, keeping us trapped in a limited reality. All this to prevent us from awakening to the true spiritual nature of existence. This realization did not come as a shock or a surprise. It was more like I was remembering something I always knew but had temporarily forgotten. It was a truth so fundamental and obvious that I wondered how I could have lived so long without realizing it. At that moment, I was sure that nothing in my life would be the same if I went back. I had glimpsed a reality far greater and deeper than anything that could be experienced in the physical world. And this experience was about to completely change the way I viewed life, death, and everything in between. I can't tell you how long I spent in that state of oneness with the universe. It could have been seconds or millennia. Time seemed to have no meaning in that dimension. But at some point, I started to feel a subtle change. At first, it was just a slight disturbance in the absolute peace that surrounded me. Then, gradually, I began to hear a distant sound. It was a rhythmic, persistent sound that seemed to come from far away. It took me a while to recognize it, but I finally realized. It was the sound of a medical device. With that recognition, I felt like something was pulling me back. It was a strange feeling, like I was being ripped away from that place of peace and understanding. Part of me wanted to resist, wanted to stay in that expanded consciousness where everything made sense. But another part knew it had to come back. The transition back to the physical world was abrupt and jarring. Suddenly, the welcoming darkness was replaced by bright, intense lights. The silence gave way to a cacophony of sounds. Beeping monitors, agitated voices, the hum of medical equipment. The pain came back with a vengeance, as if my body was reminding me of all its physical limitations. Each breath was an effort. Each heartbeat seemed to require immense energy. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the bright light. The shapes around me were blurry at first, but gradually they became clearer. I saw familiar faces, doctors, nurses, all with expressions of relief and astonishment. Dr. Delgado was leaning over me, his eyes wide with surprise. "Montserrat," he said, his voice shaking, "you're back. For a moment we thought we'd lost you." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and sore. I felt a hand holding mine, and I turned my head to see who it was. Miguel was there, tears in his eyes, a smile of relief on his face. "You're back, Montserrat," he said, shaking my hand. "Don't ever do that again." Little by little, I got my bearings. I was back in the operating room, surrounded by medical equipment and exhausted but relieved professionals. The clock on the wall showed that it had been several hours since I went into surgery. My mind was in a whirlwind. The memories of my experience were still vivid, contrasting sharply with the physical reality around me. I wanted to tell everyone what I had experienced, share the truths I had discovered. But at the same time, I knew it was something difficult to explain, something that perhaps not everyone was ready to hear. At that moment, my priority was my baby. With effort, I managed to murmur, "My son, how is he?" The nurse next to me smiled gently. "He's fine, Montserrat. He's in the neonatal ICU, but he's strong like his mother." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Despite all the turbulence of my experience, the maternal instinct remained strong. I wanted to see my son, touch him, make sure he was really okay. But my body was still too weak for that. In the days that followed, I gradually regained my physical strength, but my mind was in constant turmoil. How could I return to normal life after what I had experienced? How could I look at the world the same way, knowing what I now knew? The 10 days I spent in the hospital after my return were a period of intense recovery, both physically and mentally. My body had experienced extreme trauma and needed time to heal. The doctors were amazed at my resilience. Dr. Delgado in particular could not hide his astonishment. "You're a miracle, Montserrat," he would often say, shaking his head in disbelief as he examined my scans. One of the biggest battles was against the idea of dialysis. My kidneys had been severely affected by preeclampsia and massive blood loss. Doctors insisted I would need dialysis to help my kidneys recover, but something inside me, perhaps a newly awakened intuition, told me that my body could heal itself naturally. After much discussion, I managed to convince the medical team to give me some time before resorting to dialysis. It was a risky decision, but I felt it was the right thing to do. To everyone's surprise, including mine, my kidneys began to show signs of recovering on their own. While my body was healing, my mind was in constant activity. The memories of my near-death experience were vivid, and I spent hours trying to process them. Sometimes I found myself staring out the hospital window, lost in thoughts about the nature of reality and the purpose of our existence. Miguel and Paloma were constant visitors, bringing not only emotional support but also news from the outside world. It was through them that I learned about people's reactions to my experience. Apparently, my resurrection had become the talk of the town, at the military base, and beyond. But what worried me most was my son. In the first few days, I could only see him through photos and videos that the nurses brought. Seeing that little being, so fragile and at the same time so strong, filled me with a love that I had never experienced before. Finally, on the 5th day, I was allowed to visit the NICU. It was an emotional and scary moment. When I held my son for the first time, I felt a deep connection, as if I could feel every beat of his little heart. In that moment, I promised him and myself that I would use my second chance at life to make a difference in the world. As the days went by, I began to notice subtle changes in myself. My perception seemed sharper, and sometimes I had flashes of intuition that I couldn't explain. It was as if the near-death experience had opened channels of perception that had previously been closed. On the 10th day, I was discharged from the hospital. Leaving that controlled environment and returning to the outside world was both exciting and scary. I knew I was about to face the challenge of integrating my extraordinary experience with everyday life, but I also knew that nothing would be the same as before. I had fundamentally changed, and I was ready to explore what that change would mean for my life going forward. The months that followed my release from the hospital were a period of profound personal transformation. Returning home with my son was the first step on a journey I could barely imagine. I soon realized that my near-death experience had fundamentally altered my perception of the world. It was as if I had gained a new pair of eyes, capable of seeing beyond superficial appearances. The things that had once seemed so important, career, status, material possessions, now seemed trivial in comparison to the greater truths I had glimpsed. One of the most significant changes was my new understanding of life and death. The fear of death, which is so common in our society, had completely disappeared. I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that death was not the end, but merely a transition to a different and, in many ways, more expansive state of existence. This new perspective caused me to question many of the beliefs and values I had mindlessly accepted my entire life. I began to see the lies and manipulations present in the system we live in the media, in politics, even in some religious institutions. It was as if a veil had been lifted, allowing me to see the truth behind the illusions. My relationships with other people have also changed drastically. I developed a deep sense of empathy and compassion. It was as if I could feel the emotions and even the physical pain of the people around me. Sometimes this sensitivity was overwhelming, and I had to learn to set limits so as not to overwhelm myself emotionally. My intuition has become much stronger and more accurate. I began to have insights into situations and people that later turned out to be correct. At first, this scared me a little, but over time, I learned to trust this new skill and use it to help others. Another significant change was my relationship with nature. I began to feel a deep connection to the natural world. Walks through the desert around El Paso, which I once found monotonous, have now become almost spiritual experiences. I could feel the pulsing energy of the earth, the plants, even the rocks. My approach to medicine has also changed. Whereas before, I relied exclusively on science and established protocols, I have now begun to integrate a more holistic understanding of health. I began to see how emotions, thoughts, and spirit affected the physical body in ways that conventional medicine often ignored. However, not all of these changes were easy to deal with. Many people around me didn't understand what I was going through. Some friends and colleagues walked away, uncomfortable with my new perspective on life. Others looked at me skeptically when I tried to share my experiences. But for every person who turned away, others seemed to be drawn to me. People who were searching for answers, who felt there was something more to life than what we are presented with. I began to become a sort of informal counselor, someone people came to when they needed guidance or comfort. Despite the challenges, I felt deeply grateful for this new perspective on life. Each day brought new discoveries, new opportunities to grow and learn. I knew I had been given a precious gift, and I was determined to use it to the best of my ability to help others and make a difference in the world. As time passed, the intuitive abilities I began to notice shortly after my near-death experience became more pronounced and refined. It was as if a sixth sense had been activated, allowing me to perceive things that were beyond the reach of the conventional five senses. One of the first abilities that manifested was an increased sensitivity to the energies of those around me. I could sense when someone was sick even before the physical symptoms manifested themselves. At first, this left me confused and a little scared. I remember one time I greeted a colleague in the hospital hallway and was hit by a wave of nausea and dizziness. 2 days later, he was diagnosed with a serious viral infection. As I became more familiar with this new sensitivity, I learned to use it constructively. I began paying more attention to subtle energy shifts in my patients, which often led me to investigate problems that weren't immediately obvious. This has proven invaluable in several early diagnoses. Another ability that developed was a kind of premonition. I began to have strong premonitions about future events, especially those related to the health and safety of those close to me. One night I woke up in a panic, certain that something was wrong with my son. I ran to his room and found him with a high fever and difficulty breathing. If not for this premonition, the consequences could have been serious. Over time, I learned to trust these hunches and act on them. This was not always easy to explain to others, especially in an evidence-based medical setting. But the results spoke for themselves, and gradually my colleagues began to respect this intuition that I seemed to have developed. One of the most surprising abilities I discovered was the ability to do something I can only describe as remote viewing. It was as if I could project my consciousness to other places and see things that were happening in the distance. This has proven particularly useful in emergency situations. I remember a case where a child had gone missing in the desert area around El Paso. The searches had already lasted 2 days without success. When I heard about the case, I closed my eyes and concentrated. Suddenly, I had a clear view of a small ravine with a distinctive rock formation. I described the location to the search team, and they found the child exactly where I had seen him. These experiences led me to question everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality and the capabilities of the human mind. I started studying different spiritual traditions and consciousness expansion practices, trying to better understand what was happening to me. However, these skills also brought challenges. Sometimes the intensity of the emotions and sensations I picked up from other people was overwhelming. I had to learn to turn off this sensitivity when necessary, to preserve my own mental and emotional health. Furthermore, not everyone reacted well when I shared my intuitions or premonitions. Some looked at me with skepticism, others with fear. I learned to be careful about who I shared these experiences with. Despite the challenges, these new skills became an integral part of who I was. They have allowed me to help people in ways I had never imagined before, and most importantly, they constantly reminded me of the interconnectedness of all things and the truly mysterious and wonderful nature of the universe in which we live. One of the most profound changes I experienced after my near-death experience was a renewed and heightened connection with nature. The natural world, which I had previously seen primarily through the lens of science and medicine, now revealed itself as a living, pulsating organism, full of consciousness and meaning. The mountains and deserts around El Paso, which I once thought of as just a backdrop to my everyday life, have become my sanctuary. I started taking regular walks, seeking the solitude and peace that only nature could offer. I vividly remember the first time I went on a hike after my recovery. It was a hot, dry day, typical of the Texas desert. As I walked up the trail, I felt like each step connected me more deeply to the earth beneath my feet. The warm, dry air I breathed seemed charged with life and energy. I stopped at a viewpoint and looked at the desert landscape that stretched to the horizon. Suddenly, I was overcome by an overwhelming sense of oneness with everything around me. It was as if I could feel the life energy flowing through the rocks, the hardy desert plants, the air itself. Tears streamed down my face as I took in the beauty and interconnectedness of it all. This experience marked the beginning of a journey of rediscovery of nature. I began studying desert plants, learning about their medicinal properties and their incredible adaptation to such a hostile environment. Every cactus, every desert flower, seemed to contain a lesson in resilience and beauty. My connection with animals has also deepened. I began to notice and appreciate the desert creatures that had previously gone unnoticed. The lizards sunning themselves on the rocks, the coyotes howling in the distance in the twilight, the eagles soaring in the deep blue sky. Each of them seemed to have a message, a piece of wisdom to share. This new connection with nature has profoundly influenced my medical practice. I began incorporating elements of natural healing into my treatments whenever possible. I started recommending walks in nature as part of therapy for patients with stress and anxiety. To my surprise and delight, many reported significant improvements in their overall well-being. I also became interested in traditional healing practices from the Native American cultures in the region. I learned about the use of medicinal herbs and healing rituals that had been passed down for generations. While I maintained my commitment to evidence-based medicine, I began to see how these ancient practices could complement and enrich modern treatments. One of the most powerful experiences I had was during a desert storm. Normally, I would have stayed at home watching the rain through the window, but that day I felt an irresistible urge to go out and experience the storm up close. I walked to an open area, feeling the heavy drops of rain on my skin. The air was charged with electricity, and I could feel the energy of the storm reverberating through my body. When lightning cut across the sky, followed by a crash of thunder, I felt no fear. Instead, I felt a deep connection to the forces of nature, a visceral understanding of the cycle of life and renewal that the storm represented. This new connection with nature brought a balance to my life that I didn't know was missing. I started structuring my days to include time outdoors, whether it's a quick walk in the local park during lunch or a weekend of camping in the mountains. I noticed that these nature experiences not only invigorated me physically, but also sharpened my intuitive abilities. I often returned from these excursions with clear insights into problems I was facing or with ideas for new treatments for my patients. My newfound appreciation for nature has also led me to become more actively involved in environmental issues. I began participating in local conservation groups and advocating for environmental protection policies. I realized that caring for nature was a natural extension of my role as a doctor. After all, the health of the planet is closely linked to the health of people. This renewed connection with the natural world has become a constant source of strength, inspiration, and healing for me. It helped me find balance between my professional and spiritual life, and constantly reminded me of the greater truths I had glimpsed during my near-death experience. Every desert sunset, every flower that bloomed in the harshest of conditions, every animal that crossed my path, it all became a reminder of the beauty and mystery of life, the interconnectedness of all things, and the miracle of my own continued existence. As the months turned into years, it became clear that my near-death experience had not just been an isolated event, but the catalyst for a complete transformation of my life. The path I was taking now was radically different from the one I had planned before that fateful surgery. My perspective on earthly existence has changed drastically. I've come to see our life here as a kind of playground of emotions and growth. Every challenge, every joy, every human interaction has become an opportunity to learn and evolve. This new vision brought deep inner peace. The fear of death, which had previously tormented me in the most difficult moments of my medical career, had completely disappeared. In its place was a serene understanding that death is not the end, but merely a transition to something even more beautiful and expansive. This absence of fear allowed me to live in a more full and authentic way. I began making decisions based not on fear or the expectations of others, but on what I felt was truly right and aligned with my greater purpose. My medical practice has evolved in ways I never could have predicted. While maintaining my commitment to evidence-based medicine, I began to incorporate a more holistic approach to health. I came to see my patients not just as bodies to be fixed, but as complete beings, body, mind, and spirit. I began offering counseling sessions alongside traditional medical treatments. Many patients reported that these conversations, in which I shared some of the insights I gained during my experience, were as healing as the medications I prescribed. My family and close friends were instrumental in this journey of transformation. Miguel, who was by my side during the most critical moments, continued to be a constant support. He helped me navigate moments of doubt and uncertainty, always reminding me of the strength I had within me. Paloma, my faithful mission companion, became a valuable partner in my new approach to medicine. Together, we began to explore ways to integrate traditional healing practices with modern medicine, always with the goal of providing the best possible care for our patients. My son, whose arrival into the world almost cost me my life, has become a constant source of joy and discovery. Watching him grow and develop reminded me daily of the miracle of life and the importance of living each moment fully. As the years passed, I began to feel a calling to share my story and the insights I gained with a wider audience. I started giving talks about my near-death experience and the changes it brought to my life. To my surprise, I discovered that there were many people eager to hear about these experiences, seeking hope and deeper meaning in their own lives. I wrote a book about my journey, combining my medical training with my spiritual experiences. The writing process was deeply therapeutic, helping me further integrate all facets of my new reality. Looking back, I realized that that critical moment in the operating room was not the end, but the true beginning of my life. Every day since then has been an opportunity to live more consciously, more compassionately, and more connected to the world around me. I know my journey is far from over. There is still a lot to learn, a lot to experience, a lot to share. But now I approach each new day with a sense of purpose and gratitude. I know I have been blessed with a second chance at life, and I am determined to use this gift to make a difference in the world. One patient, one conversation, one moment at a time. The beauty that awaits after death is no longer a mystery to me, but a source of comfort and inspiration. She constantly reminds me to live this life fully, to love deeply, to serve with compassion. And in doing so, I feel like I'm honoring not just my own journey, but the interconnectedness of all things, the eternal dance of life and death, the physical and the spiritual. This is the new path I have chosen to follow. A path of continuous discovery, of holistic healing, of deep connection with nature and with others. It's a path that challenges me every day, but it also brings me a joy and peace that I never imagined possible. And for that I am eternally grateful. So what did you think of this incredible story? Leave your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Activate the notification bell to be notified with each new video. Let's bring more people the hope that there is life beyond what the eyes can see.